verse 1 of Esther chapter 6. That day the king could not sleep. So he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and to be read to him. The king could not sleep. So instead of being wide awake and doing nothing, he asks for the book of the Chronicles to be read to him. The fact that the king could not sleep seems to be a very small thing, but God even uses his lack of sleep to forward his purposes. I am of the opinion, friends, that the king would have had many such sleepless nights. As Shakespeare said, uneasy lies the head that wears the crown. There were nights when I'm sure the king felt that his life was in jeopardy. But this night that the king could not sleep was the most eventful night in the history of the empire, because it is this night that is the turning point in the book of Esther. Have you noticed that God uses the little things to carry out his program? Years before, remember in Egypt, God brought together a woman's heart and a baby's cry. When Pharaoh's daughter found Moses, baby Moses, in the river Nile, by this he changed the destiny of an entire nation. A supposedly unimportant thing occurred at the palace of King Xerxes. The king could not sleep, so he commanded his servants to bring the uninteresting records of the kingdom to him. They were read before the king. Evidently, the reading of these records was conducive to sleep. They were the king's sleeping pill. The fatal hour had come, and now we are going to see the hand of God begin to move, dear friend. A servant was summoned who began to drone off this record, which is like a log or the minutes of the kingdom. I do not mean to be rude, but to me the most boring thing in the world is to listen to minutes. It puts me to sleep, and that's exactly what the king wanted to do. On the nights that the king could not sleep, he would say, "Bring in the minutes. Let's read them again." Soon the king would doze off and drop to sleep. The best way to sleep is to read the minutes. On this particular night, the servant just happened to turn to a certain place in the book of minutes. Did I use the word happened to turn? Little things are beginning to pile up, dear friend, and to reveal God's hand in the glove of human circumstances. God is moving. God is overruling. It is no accident that Esther became queen. It is no accident that she presented herself to the king and found favor in his sight. It is no accident that he accepted her invitation to a banquet. And now it is no accident that he is unable to sleep. The servant turns to this particular passage in the book of minutes, and that too is no accident. Verse 2. It was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this? The king asked. Nothing has been done for him. His attendants answered. These two men belonged to the mafia of that day. Mordecai overheard these two men plotting, the kind of plotting that we always think of in connection with the Persian Empire. Shadowy figures behind pillars plotting in low tones of putting a dagger in the king's back. Mordecai passed the word on to Queen Esther. She notifies the king. That incident was recorded in the Chronicles of the kingdom. When the servant read this, the king became alert for a moment. He rose up in bed and said, "By the way, I didn't hear you read, or I must have missed it. Was this man, Mordecai, rewarded?" The servant looked down and read the next few minutes and replied, "No, he has never been rewarded." The king said, "The man who saved my life must be rewarded." While all this was going on in the palace, there is a knock at the outside door. The king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows he had erected for him. His attendants answered, Haman is standing in the court. Bring him in, the king ordered. When Haman entered, the king asked, What should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought to himself, Who is there that the king would rather honor than me? Just at that time, the king discovered Mordecai had never been rewarded for saving his life. Haman was heard coming into the outer court. The king said, Who's in the court? It was Haman. He hadn't slept too well either. Two people, the king and the prime minister, are not sleeping. He had come to the king's house to get permission to hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had already built and prepared for him. Haman apparently had the privilege of coming into the king's presence at any time, not even a privilege given to the queens. When Haman came in, the king brought him into the conversation without giving him any background at all. He had come to ask for the life of Mordecai at the same moment the king is prepared to reward him. These circumstances reveal the providence of God. In the shadows, God is keeping watch over his own. Although these people are out of the will of God, in the land far away from where God wants them, they are still not out from under his direct leading. These providential dealings could not have been accident at all. So when Haman walks into the king's presence, he is greeted with a question, What should be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? Haman thought the king was talking about him. Sad, very sadly mistaken. After all, he had been prime minister. He had been given the king's ring. He had paid a certain sum of money to be able to get permission to exterminate the Jewish people en toto. And certainly there was no one else in the kingdom who the king could think of to delight in and honor. But surprisingly, the king was thinking of not Haman, but Haman's greatest enemy, Mordecai. So he answered the king, For the man the king delights to honor, have them, 1, bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse, 2, the king has ridden on, 1 with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor, and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. The true nature of Haman is revealed here, my friend. I'm sure you can see what is in his heart. Haman had his eye upon the throne. It was his intention, when the time was right, to eliminate the king himself. Really, that is the story of Persian monarchs anywhere. It was difficult for a man to stay on the throne very long. Even in Israel's history as recorded in 1 and 2 Kings, if it were not so tragic, it could even be humorous to see how short a time some of the kings ruled. Some of them made it only for 2 months, can you imagine? When a king sat on his throne and looked around, he didn't know who was his friend or who was his enemy. He couldn't imagine because he realized that any man who was lifted up would attempt to slay him in order to become the next king. Obviously, this was in the heart of cunning Haman. Haman was thinking, To whom would the king delight to do honor more than to myself? You let me have the apparel of the king, put the crown on my head, let me ride the king's horse. Let it be announced by the herald when I go through the streets. What is he doing? Haman is preparing the people for the day when the crown and the royal apparel will be his and his alone. I am of the opinion that the king would suspect this type of thing, for he recognized that Haman was thinking of himself, certainly not of Mordecai. Go at once, the king commanded Haman, get the robe and the horse, and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew, can you imagine Haman's face, who sits at the king's gate? Do not neglect anything you have recommended. Can you imagine? Haman recommends the elevation of Mordecai. There was nothing that could have been asked of Haman that would have been more displeasing, toxic, and cruel than to put the royal garments on Mordecai, put him on the king's own horse, leading him through the streets, proclaiming that this man is who the king has delighted in and so is honoring. To accord him this honor was mortification beyond words to Haman. He hated Mordecai. So we see verse 11. So Haman got the robe and the horse. He robed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor." Instead of leading Mordecai through the streets in honor, Haman had planned to hang him on the gallows. The humiliation of Haman at this point is absolutely unspeakable. You can imagine the feeling that he had when he led the horse. The man who would not bow to him is seated on the horse, is rode through the streets, is led by the very man who plotted his death. He had a gallows at his home. Remember the height, 75 feet high, on which to hang him. Afterward, Mordecai returned to the king's gate. But Haman rushed home. Verse 12. Mordecai returned. Haman rushed, his head covered in grief, and told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. His advisers and his wife said to him, notice the very wife who had designed the gallows is the one who says these words, Zeresh, since Mordecai before whom your downfall has started is of Jewish origin, referring to Mordecai's God, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin. Very encouraging. While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived, hurried Haman away to the banquet Esther had prepared. Oh friends, from verses 12 to 14 we see the ordeal was finally over. Mordecai returned to the king's gate. Haman hurries to his house, mourning, his head covered, shame upon shame. He told his wife and friends everything that happened. Zeresh was quite a wife. She is the one who suggested the gallows to be built, and now she's saying, be prepared for your own gallows. It's not exactly comforting to have your own wife and friends suggest probably that tomorrow would be your last day on earth. Things are happening thick and fast. Notice how fast they are happening. Haman no sooner gets home, he explains to his wife and his wise men around him, his friends, what happened. And then, at that moment, there is a knock on the door. The king's servants tell Haman to hurry up. The banquet is ready, that he promised to attend. He was really, you remember, looking forward to this dinner. How he boasted about the fact that he was the only one whom the queen invited with the king to attend her banquet. But now he was going to be late for dinner. The same dinner he was so eagerly looking forward to. But the events were taking place so fast that Haman could not keep up with the events. Things are beginning to happen to his disadvantage. He has no control over the circumstances. You know why? Because God is overruling everything and making sure that this cunning Haman's plot does not succeed. His plot to exterminate the entire Jewish population in the nation of Persia. Friends, God's power cannot be limited. We must never mistake God's silences for his lack of concern. I really believe the longer God is silent, the greater will be his manifest power. God plans our future as we know our past. God bless you richly.